right, good morning. My name is Jessica Tangeman, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Hackster Impact Summit. We're live streaming here from a cold and foggy San Francisco out of Microsoft Reactor, and we are very excited to bring you our second day of sessions. Now, today, we're starting off with a very interesting panel discussion. I've got a lot of fantastic people with me this morning to get us started. We'll move into a few workshops. We've got community spotlights later in the day and a couple more demos for you guys to check out, ending today's session with a live stream video chat with our Edge Impulse team over on the Hackster Discord, so be sure to check that out. Full agenda is over on our event page, so if you want to know what's coming up next, check out the event page or head over to the lobby in between sessions and see what else we have coming up. Cool. All right, so let's get started with today's first panel, titled Crossing the Chasm, a discussion of scaling sustainable practices and strategies to lead impact in organizations. So we've brought a lot of very diverse backgrounds into today's panel. We want to talk to them about the mindsets they have when they're building products, they're expanding customer base, and they're contributing more towards a meaningful technology evolution. We've got people from, the research background representing government agencies. So we'll have a pretty interesting discussion following. So let's talk a little bit about who we have on our panel today. Fran Baker is on our panel. Fran is the Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at ARM. Her work focuses on extending the benefits of technology to people and areas not currently benefiting. She works with partners worldwide, from social entrepreneurs to global organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, UNICEF, and Fauna and Flora International. Fran's been recognized as a United Nations SDG pioneer for the UK, studies artificial intelligence, ethics, and society at the University of Cambridge, and sits on the TinyML for Good working group. Lots of good perspective there. We also have Calum Handforth. Calum is the United Nations Advisor and Cambridge Policy Fellow, focusing on data, innovation, and digital tech in international development and government. He has designed and led global projects and programs focusing on understanding how technology can improve the lives and livelihoods of the most marginalized populations. We know Calum very well with our 2020 COVID-19 Detect and Protect contest. So some of you might have worked with Calum when you were participating in that contest with us not too long ago. Thomas Soederholm. Thomas Soederholm is the VP of Business Development at Nordic Semiconductor. He drives the development and adoption of Nordic's products in the wireless personal area networks, or PAN, arena, which ranges from sports and fitness all the way through consumer health and medical. Thomas joined Nordic straight out of his graduate program in 1999, and he spent his whole working career growing with the company, first as a digital designer, then into sales, and then into business development and business relations. So we'll get some good perspective from the commercialized side of the business, and knowing the company so intimately from different perspectives, he'll bring a lot of good insight. Joe Simon is a senior program manager at the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where he leads the solar manufacturing and competitiveness portfolio and several workforce development efforts. He has led the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Decathlon Build Challenge, created by Solar District Cup, and recently launched the Energy Tech University Prize for business plans that commercialize emerging energy technology. So outside of the lab, he serves as the immediate past president of the board for a 7,500 seat outdoor amphitheater, hosting 50 free concerts per year, and co-founded Alley Flats, a startup building modular accessory dwelling units for Denver. And then last but not least, we have Leo Banchik on our panel this morning. Leo Banchik is the partner at Global Founders Capital, GFC, where he focuses on early stage climate tech investments. Leo has 15 years of climate tech experience spanning across consulting, startups, government, and engineering research. He was formerly in McKinsey's sustainability practice, where he worked on sustainable investing, go-to-market, and mergers and acquisitions, and decarbonization for organizations in climate tech, the future of mobility, and ESG. So prior to McKinsey, he led product innovation at an advanced desalination startup called Sandy Mount. And he has started his sustainability career as a scientist at 2 national labs, Lawrence Berkeley and Oak Ridge, and as a policy researcher at the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Whew. All right, let's bring these panelists in today and get started. All right. Hey, everyone. Be sure to unmute your mics.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Howdy.
You guys have some crazy bio. I almost got through the entire thing. That last one, I fumbled a little bit, but all right, so we've got a few questions on the panel today. I think we're going to have a lot of interesting perspective from your different backgrounds as we come in. But why don't we start off with the very general question of impact and sustainability? What do those terms actually mean? You know, because we work with a lot of companies, and even in the community, we have a tag for sustainability, we have a tag for impact on projects on Hackster. But what that means can vary depending on what you're representing within your organization. So maybe, Fran, we could start off with you. How has ARM internalized the concept of impact and sustainability, and what does that actually mean to you guys?
Yeah, okay, sure. Hi, everybody. Very pleased to be here. So starting with how we define sustainability, we follow the definition that describes sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generations' ability to meet their own needs. And that's obviously extremely broad in scope, but it's absolutely necessary to consider that breadth, as sustainability issues are complex. They aren't single issues, but they're interconnected and global in nature, and it reflects the social, the environmental, and economic concerns altogether. And that global breadth of issue is reflected in global frameworks like the planetary boundaries concept, for example, or the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, the Paris Agreement, the Declaration of Human Rights. And so then situating myself back inside a private sector company, inside my organization, inside ARM, businesses don't exist in a vacuum. They aren't resistant to environmental or social shocks. We exist within industries, within society, within the planet that we operate on, and you cannot have sustainable business on an unsustainable planet. And so consideration for sustainability issues isn't just a nice to have, it's essential for the future of successful businesses. And that's even in terms of things like talent attraction and retention, and whether people want to work for certain organizations. And more foundationally than that, for ensuring just, fair, secure, sustainable life on Earth. And so with the question regarding impact and, for example, how those different impact or sustainability issues are assessed, or different indices that measure them, different measurement tools exist from different aspects, whether it's environmental sustainability, whether it's social impact. And focusing on environmental impact, for example, we focus on measuring our carbon impact as the largest material impact of our organization. Tools for carbon measurement are fairly well established, and at ARM we follow the greenhouse gas protocol. But the tools for carbon measurement aren't without challenges, particularly in measuring scope 3 impacts. So that's impacts in the value chain that organizations have much less control over. And so where the protocol is not specific enough, it's important that organizations are transparent about their interpretation, their methodologies, and put those metrics into context, so it's easier to understand the scale of the impact that they have or haven't achieved. And from a social impact perspective, just to round that out, is that quite often there's a challenge between depth and breadth of measurement, so standardized measurement across projects, programs, organizations, and so on. So how do you describe that impact? You really need to define it first. And so quite often we talk about reach, which is an imperfect measure, absolutely, as in how many people has a particular initiative reached. but that doesn't necessarily measure or capture the impact or the quality of that intervention, which might be better assessed qualitatively or in some cases anecdotally. So I think there's different organizations have different definitions and different ways to categorize it. And then it also reflects in terms of how they then measure said impact or sustainability criteria.
So a lot of the work that you guys do at ARM and within the sustainability department, I guess the business unit that you work in, right?
Yeah.
How much of that is defined by ARM and the initiatives that you guys are driving, and how much of that is defined by the global organizations that are setting those protocols and those standards?
Yeah, so it depends on which aspect of sustainability we're considering, say whether it's environmental, whether it's social impact. But to take it from a social impact perspective, we always start with what does the world need? So my stakeholders, I always say, are people and planet. What does the world need from an organization like us? One business, one individual, one organization is not going to solve all of the problems that the world has on their own. It has to be multi-sector, interdisciplinary partnerships that are delivering against that impact. But I think it's in terms of how you layer those insights. So start with what the world needs. That's already been done. We already know what the world needs. It's written in the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the world's biggest to-do list. Layer then on what your capabilities are as an organization. So ARM is in the tech industry. We have particular skills, we have particular resources available to us, whether that's in terms of our employees, our assets, our technology, our funding, and then go deeper in each layer based on that. So starting from the outside, what's already been identified, what the world needs from the problem holders, layer on your own unique capabilities as an organization, and then segment that in the way that you so choose. So we, for example, don't pick one goal to focus on because we think that there's a role for technologies to have outsized impact across all different segments or areas, whether it's education, environment, so on. But then find the ways that you can actually have the most unique contribution. So I think in different sectors, you might refer to it as additionality or the unique contribution that you as an organization have the capabilities to deliver.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess sticking on the corporate side of it, Thomas, I know that sustainability is one of the top goals for Nordic and drives a lot of conversations that you have both with customers or selecting customers, and then also internally at your business. Fran mentioned the carbon reduction at ARM and dedication towards more United Nations. But from the company's perspective, how has the definition of sustainability or impact, how have you adapted your own internal processes in terms of choosing, sustainable materials for products, or does that go into prototyping and design? How do you guys define sustainability and impact, and then follow through with that with what you do at Nordic?
Well, let me just start by saying that I think it should be on everyone's mind, whether it's a tech company or someone else, that we need to be sustainable. We need to work for a greener planet and all that, right? So I think what's happened over the last few years with our industry and with Nordic is that we've become a lot more conscious about it. So now there's no hiding that chip development is a resource consuming process. So what we do as a company is sort of look at how can we even that out in the downstream. So how can we even it out through the development of the chips that we do to the customers that we work with, right? And as a company, we do have a strong focus on sustainability, like you said. We are members of the Responsible Business Alliance and the UN and a UN Global Compact signatory. And everyone in the organization is also measured on KPIs to sort of strive towards this sustainability goal. So it's driving everything we do as a company, and that's everything from supply chain, working with our suppliers on environmental product compliance, to R&D developing system on chips that are super power efficient, that use as little silicon area as possible, and then also through sales and marketing, working towards markets, applications, and customers who can make an impact on these UN Sustainable Development Goals.
That's interesting. It's an interesting perspective to think with the global chip shortage, you have to be fairly selective in the customers that you're working with, because not everyone gets all the cake and can eat it too, right? So, so when you're working from the business development perspective, how do you define, you understand to your business and to the global environment what means, what impact and sustainability mean, but how do you guys handpick what customers you work with? Is it based on, the exact solution they're trying to build? Is it, what goes into that decision-making process?
Well, I mean, truth be told, looking at the history of the company and what we do, we've always been a company who opens up to everyone. We're a very development-driven company. We love to work with development teams in all kinds of different companies, small or big. Like you said, supply has been an issue over the last couple of years. It's extremely challenging still. Without being too political, I would say that I feel that there are decisions being made way above our heads on where to focus the chip shortage. Things that I would say doesn't agree with me personally, for sure. I certainly don't think more cars is going to help us. I do think medical, climate change, you name it, those things are more important than just another car, right? But to your question, how do we pick? We try to be as friendly as possible in this situation that we are. Like I said, we work with so many different customers around the world. We want to try to enable and support everyone. So trying to be fair, we do supply what we have evenly so that we can help everyone. But of course, like I said, we are all measured internally on with KPIs on sustainable goals. So there is a little box to tick for everyone that they should work with companies that act in that fashion.
Great. Okay, so Calum, both Fran and Thomas brought up the United Nations in terms of how companies are defining their strategy moving forward of what sustainability means to them, or even to track progress of how they can report on what they're doing as being sustainable. So from the UN's perspective, you're setting the standard for the industry of how we define sustainability. What do you have to say towards, the protocols that the UN has put in place? How do you define sustainability in the work that you do, and how does that impact how you work with organizations like ARM or Nordic, or even NREL and GEF?
Thanks, Jessica. I think Fran did a phenomenal job actually listing a number of initiatives, frameworks, and protocols that obviously we've shaped and collaborated with multiple different sectors around as well. So I won't reverse that. What I would say is that when we're thinking about sustainability, particularly in the kind of context of some of your innovators, there's a really interesting angle that sometimes we forget about. So obviously climate change, sustainability in that context, biodiversity, these border issues as well, COP27 coming, in a handful of weeks. These are fundamental issues. More broadly, though, looking at sustainability, it's also how we sustain good ideas over the longer term too. There's still a real issue about, how do we move beyond a kind of pilot setting? How do we look at scale, particularly where it's appropriate? So when we're working with innovators and innovation ecosystems around the world, how do we build the structures, the skills, the policies, the frameworks, so that we are sustaining what really does work and also learning from what doesn't work either? So I'm not using here the kind of standard definition of sustainability that I think we've covered very well on the panel, but looking at this kind of broader sustainability ethos as well. Kind of linked to that as well is also this kind of impact notion too. So within the UN system, UNDP were the stewards of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So these, as I'm sure many of you already know, are truly kind of global goals all interrelated, all about driving positive and sustainable and sustained positive global change around the world. But again, there's also nuance in what impact can mean in different contexts, and Fran covered this very nicely. But just in terms of a recent example, I've been working with a number of digital health innovators, and they're starting to think about this dichotomy between lifespan and health span. So it's not just about the longevity of someone's life, but the quality of someone's life as well. So even when we start thinking about impact, there's a lot of nuance, I think, there to unpack. And again, Fran made this point as well about measurement and really understanding what we're and where we're looking to try to move the needle. So when we look at the impact, where can you have the most impact? Where can you bring your kind of comparative advantage? Where can you add the most success, or bring in the most needed skills and impact in that context too? And so a lot of our work around the world is working with innovators from some of the smallest enterprises through to the biggest governments to build the enabling environment to make sure that impact is positive, it's targeted where it's needed most, and also that it's sustained over the longer term as well.
That's really interesting. Leo, we kind of skipped over you a little bit on the last question, but now that we're talking about, how policymakers are working more with companies, you have this background where you're looking for climate tech startups. What goes into the decision-making process for you when you're looking at what startups to fund? How do you decide on which opportunities will be the most fruitful in terms of making the biggest impact?
Totally. I'll start from the top, and then I'll answer your question, just to give folks in the audience a bit of an understanding of the pickle that we're in. We have to effectively we have 40 gigatons of emissions per year, and we need to drop that by 50 to 55% by 2030. That means we have if you follow the IPCC and some other folks that are modeling and forecasting this out. So that means that in 8 years, we need to drop emissions by 50%. By 2050, we need to drop emissions by almost to net zero, and we need to start ramping up what are called carbon removals because we've overshot our budget. And that's a tall order, because if you think about 50% by 2030 emission reduction, remember COVID, when the whole world shut down? I think that reduced emissions by about 7%. So the world shutting down gave 7%. Now we need to go down to 50 in 8 years. So what we need a tremendous innovation ecosystem. We need lots of startups, but also incumbents, making net zero commitments and sticking to them and really following it through. It's the grand challenge of our time. And so now getting to your question, Jessica, about what startups that we like to fund at GFC, startups that help tackle that issue. So either on the carbon removal side, or on the carbon reduction side, right? So it's the analogy is like you've got a bathtub and you've got carbon going into the bathtub, water going into the bathtub, too much water. You need to turn the tap off, but you also need to drain the bathtub, and that bathtub is our atmosphere, and what's flowing in and what's there is too much CO2. So I'm taking a very CO2 specific approach. There's lots of great startups in water. There's lots of great startups in ESG and measurement, et cetera, et cetera. But if we're just talking about sustainability, the carbon problem, each vertical, that drives our global economy needs to be kind of revolutionized in a green way. So we're talking green steel, green cement, electric vehicles, industrial decarbonization, all of the foundries that make the chips that go in, that ARM works with, and Thomas as well. Those need to become green over time. Fran did a great job, I agree with Calum, mentioning all the protocols out there. Scope 1, 2, 3. Each business needs to understand, first measure their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and then tackle them. And so we like to invest in companies that help tackle that problem. I'd say from a VC perspective, you can imagine what we look for in startups broadly. Great teams, great business models, good traction. But we're early stage investors, which is something different than what later stage investors may look for. But I would say, just to go back and make sure I'm answering your question, predominantly we're looking for teams that are focusing on specifically decarbonizing the verticals that are going to get us from 40 gigatons down to roughly 20 gigatons in the next 8 years. Did that answer your question, Jessica?
Yeah, definitely. And we have another question lined up a little bit later in the panel if we have some extra time, because I'm curious, you touched on this a little bit. I'm curious as how you're advising companies to go green, right? Like, what does that actually mean to go green? And when you have those conversations with them, but let's finish this first discussion. There's so many topics to cover within a 45-minute time frame. I want to bring Joe, I want to bring you in because we did talk a little bit about the relationship between policymakers and we have the United Nations here who's setting the standards that companies are, following. And then we've got Fran and Thomas here talking about how companies are making an effort to achieve those and find ways to measure it. From NREL's perspective, you guys do a ton of this background research, right? How are you getting that research and the work that you do out to all of these policymakers or to companies like ARM and Nordic? You're doing all the dirty work. How do we
Sure.
encourage that conversation?
No, I think it's really interesting to consider that idea, and particularly the timelines that are being discussed right now. So when we think about the research organization, what's thought of on a 5 or 10 year horizon, but also how do you get those innovations to market and how do you allow it to expand at the speed and scale that's necessary to make a difference? And so I think there's been this real push to change that perspective, particularly from the researcher point of view, to understand it's not always publications, it can also be partnerships, it can be that collaboration with industry, it can be the understanding of where that innovation can fit in the deployment or development cycle, so that it can be an opportunity where the national labs or the investments by federal governments can de-risk that decision, so that organizations can make that choice to adopt that technology, can make that choice to adopt that pathway that allows for a lower carbon emission footprint, it allows for that change. But I also think this was touched on earlier, that idea of sustainability definitely ties to knowledge as well. So if all of the knowledge is held in the head of just one person, and then that industry or that one startup doesn't succeed, then what? So how do you transfer that information? So through summits like this, through other conversations, through that ability to understand the greater goal and to share the way where there are innovations to be achieved, but the speed and scale is really where the opportunity lies to introduce these things at a way that can make a difference in the time frame that we need.
So as companies and through your own research, as companies, even small tech startups or climate tech startups that Leo works with too, are there resources available online for companies who are trying to get started? Yesterday's summit was all about, I have a skill set and I know that there's a need, I want to get started and help. Where do we direct people like that want to know what standards they should be developing towards?
Sure. So I think those publications are always available, but also, at least in the US, there's been a great push to this type of competition or collaboration ecosystem. So there's the recently launched American Made Challenges structure, there's other competitions and prizes. And so I run a number of them at the collegiate scale to get those students thinking about the business opportunities to explore emerging energy technologies, to see how that opportunity exists to make that difference. But I think balancing those areas so that there's funding opportunities that may be non-dilutive, that maybe don't take the level of experience that might be necessary for a large competed funding opportunity, but can get that first step. So you can collaborate with the resources or with the technologies or the knowledge that's available at national labs or are available at other organizations that participate in these types of competitions, can allow someone to jumpstart that process, to be able to explore an early idea, see where there's some traction, and then move on from there to the next conversation. So I do think finding those lighter lift ways to engage with those funding opportunities through the US government, through other areas, is really a great first step.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think a lot of it is mindset, right? We have a lot of people on the panel here that can spit off a bunch of stats and give us perspective on the issue and how severe the issue is. But in order for us to actually move forward in terms of innovating the next big thing or evolving the way that we do things today, it's about adjusting your mindset of how we're building and how we're working. Part of that's starting through a lot of youth management, working with these giant competitions, Joe, that you're leading. So part of your bio is this giant solar decathlon and all of these contests you guys are doing. Can you tell us a little bit more about where that stems from, from the National Laboratory? How did you come across this type of opportunity and build that out for students?
Sure. So I began as a student myself as a competitor in one of these competitions in the Solar Decathlon, building a net zero house as an undergraduate student, and have since seen about 50,000 alumni go through across the world. So we have the event exists in the US, but also in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Europe, in India, China, and in Morocco. And so we've seen this sort of global participation where students are able to, really get that hands-on and learning experience and collaborate with industry. And some of those ideas may succeed, some of them may not, but that innovation mindset, I think, sticks with them for the next 30 or 40 years of their career as they try to encourage that participation. And so we've continued to grow that effort now, not just with the building industry, but also with solar and storage and geothermal and other areas. And now with the more recent launch with a business plan focused area for emerging energy technologies, helping researchers, whether it's at a university or at a national lab, identify what that commercialization pathway might be. We sometimes see that there might be a gap between the person who is great at developing the new innovation and the person who can bring it to scale, who can actually find out where does it fit in the line of manufacturing capabilities or existing resources, where does it fit in the sort of that product market fit. May not be the same person determining a new way to grow a solar cell on a backsheet. They may be two different people, and that's okay.
When you transition from, everything that you've discovered or through contests like that, and then your own research from the laboratory, do you ever receive any pushback from, the old-fashioned industries that you're working with to be like, it costs too much money to be sustainable, or that's just not how we do it, or I don't have access to those kind of resources? What kind of feedback do you get from, that commercialization process?
I think it probably the similar conversations to many, but then it's really looking at the greater picture. So if you have a different lifespan, if you have a different set of operations and maintenance, if you have a different set of performance metrics, how do you point it out in a way that is that word of sustainability that I think others spoke about earlier, that is sustainable of the people, that's sustainable of the process, that's sustainable of the energy used up front versus energy used over time. And so I think looking at that bigger picture really becomes part of the conversation. So it's not always first cost, which of course matters, but it is that greater picture for how people make their decisions.
Thomas, I want to spin this back over to you. Working with a lot of your customers and the requests for different types of applications and solutions that come in, have you seen a shift in companies asking about ways to become more sustainable, or when they're asking about an application, are people asking questions like, how big of is this footprint? How big of an impact will this make once deployed?
Right. Yeah, no, let me start by saying that we're starting to see more and more of the, I would say, the more established companies, the larger companies. They are focusing obviously a lot on sustainability and carbon footprint to be like Leo said, 100% carbon free. What we see is that a lot of these companies are coming to us now and starting a discussion and starting a conversation on what's the impact that Nordic brings to that calculation, right? And yes, it's an eye opener for a lot of people in the company, including. And I think what's more important is it's starting to sort of change from the top down. So let's say from the end customer and trickle down towards the suppliers and the subcontractors, right? And to Leo's point, I think that's the most important thing, is to look at, from our perspective, years from now, can we get to a lower carbon footprint wafer supply, packaging, and so on. So yes, I think we see that trickling down from a lot of our customers willing to have those conversations and interested in how Nordic's eco footprint is impacting their designs. I also want to say that I think in that setting, we're seeing shifts in the world of technology, where technology companies are, I would say, being forced at this point to go more green, to look at reusability, repairability, and so on. I think that's a terrific way of looking at it. Make the new smartphone so that it can be easily repaired and it can work for a lot more years, right? And with that, I think when you look at the technology that we're making our technology so flexible so that it's easy for our end customers to do firmware upgrades in the field after the fact, to do bug fixes, to add features, to add value to existing products so that products can live longer in the life cycle. And I think that's part of the discussion that we're having right here.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I know Nordic, just from we work with Nordic for many years. Everything that you guys do, in every sense of the word, is sustainable, right? I was talking with, Trina on your team about your new facility and how you're even going to have like bee boxes up on the roof and support the local bee population, and then all the employees get tasty honey. There's so many ways that companies, I think, when you're looking at the term sustainability, that can be injected into how a company runs, right? Not only the mindset of what you're building and how you're building it and where you're making an impact, but also the way that you do it, right? The way that you approach your mindset of work, so that that's always top of mind when you're working. So I do want to go back to this go green question, right? So Leo, I'm going to bring you back in. What does go green actually mean? When someone says, I'm going green, or we're a very green organization, as a VC that's looking at companies, you're advising them on becoming more green. How does that conversation unfold with a company?
I'd love to hear Fran's perspective as well, maybe afterwards, on how ARM views it. But what I'd say is most of the startups that I'm working with are very early stage and helping other businesses go green. And so what I'll probably rely on more to answer this question is my McKinsey experience consulting with very large corporates, sometimes, Fortune 100 companies, on how to go green, rather than the startups who are basically trying to make others green. I'd say, it all starts with understanding, if you're a big company and you've got a big carbon footprint, which is different than these little startups that are, 5 folks in a laptop, in some cases in a lab working on a technology. But if you're a big company, thousands of employees, large supply chain, it starts with understanding the carbon that you're emitting in your scope 1, which is kind of within your organization, or scope 2, which is the power that you use to power your organization, or scope 3, which is kind of everything in the supply chain. So it starts with measurement, right? Everybody knows you can't manage what you don't measure. So it starts with measurement. You got to do a baseline or a footprint exercise and understand where the carbon it doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but it has to be directional. Once you do that, you can build what's called a MAC curve, which is called the marginal abatement cost curve, which helps you understand where the carbon is being emitted in your organization and how much it's going to cost to switch from the status quo to a green alternative. And in many cases, we have the technology today to both go green and save money. So in certain parts of the world, it's much cheaper to make solar energy than it is to buy coal-fired power off of the grid. In certain cases, it's much cheaper to put a heat pump into your manufacturing facility than it is to run a natural gas boiler. And that's because, solar energy has come screaming down in cost by a factor of 10x over the last 10, 15 years. And it's just unlocked things that weren't possible 10 years ago during Climate Tech 1.0 that we can now see in the new Climate Tech wave. So the field has shifted. And so there are a lot of things that you can do if you build this MAC curve. There are a lot of kind of levers you can pull bring in technologies that are cheaper than the status quo. That's called having a negative green premium, as Bill Gates might say. And you can start making that shift today. There's then other levers that might be more expensive. Like for instance, switching your fleet to electric vehicles might be marginally cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles right now. It's going to get better over time as batteries come down in cost, but you know, that's something that's kind of on the margin. And then there's other things that are much more expensive to go green. For those, you need to start kind of saving up, making plans or offsetting, which I think is not the solution for everything. That should be reduction plus offsetting. But that's really the way to tackle it. And I think to hold yourself accountable to these as a large organization, there's another organization that I don't think has been mentioned yet, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, or CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. And so you can take your baseline exercise, take all the carbon that you've measured in your organization, and make a pledge to go net zero by a certain time. That would be, you know, and then to develop a plan to green your business, reduce the carbon emissions across your scopes, to allow us to hit a 1.5 or a 2 degrees Celsius target by 2030. So that's what we would advise folks to do at McKinsey. Would love to hear from the other panelists what they view as going green. But I'd say it's having a net zero plan, having a commitment to reducing your carbon emissions, and then sticking to it with milestones along the way.
It's very interesting. Fran, he called you out, and I know that ARM has a lot of programs, specifically the 2030 Vision program that you direct to. Is this part of the Go Green concept for ARM?
I would actually answer it in a slightly different way, in that I think there's obviously a real big watch out in terms of organizations greenwashing or impact washing, or basically trying to claim credit for things that you're not proactively doing. But if we're referring to going green as environmental sustainability, I think it's looking at how you make money from different perspectives. So firstly, integrating environmental sustainability decisions into your business operations. A good way to do that is through completing GHG inventories, so you understand where your emission sources are, the scale of them, and then setting plans and targets to reduce them, as Leo has already mentioned. That'll lead to integrated changes across your business, as your inventory will inevitably cover the whole of the organization. And then secondly, looking at the product or service that you sell and assessing its impact. And that will be different for, as Leo's mentioned, like 5 people and a laptop in a small scale startup versus a massive global organization, but looking at whether that impact is positive or negative. There's a lot of revenue opportunities out there for the tech sector to respond to these green problems, but I was scribbling different things down as Leo was talking, in that expectations are changing from governments, from consumers, from employees. It's not just one person, a trickle-down effect from the top, it's top-down, bottom-up. The world is changing. And I always think of the Christiana Figueres quote, who was executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Correct me if I'm wrong, Calum, but she's a big deal, describing that we will reach net zero by design or default. It's going to happen, whether it works in humanity's favor or not. So I think that to me is really powerful, in that some of the questions that had come up about costs, how much is it going to cost us to adapt to these kinds of situations? We're going to have to, so it's either now or in the future. Where do you want to put your money and when? I think, yeah, I will stop it there, but I think, yeah, it will either be expensive now, but more expensive in the future.
It's a good point too, because how should companies be integrating practical sustainability practices into their business, right? Or as a part of their business? And maybe I can spin this back over to you, Calum, because I know you work from a global perspective, but also with very localized initiatives. How do companies approach that challenge, and how do you advise them there?
It is an enormous challenge. So I think there's a few years tied together. So Thomas very nicely mentioned, right to repair, the kind of responsibility there on the kind of producer side about how do we make these devices, beyond obsolescence, as it were. We're having some broader conversations and seeing some other interesting things happening. For example, when we look at emerging technologies, particularly ones driven by data, a lot of emissions are being developed, are being caused by, big data sets, training data sets, and so on. other efforts that we can look at about kind of open sourcing data sets, having these kind of more openness in this context, so we're not running the same machine learning models over and over again. There's also the other side, how do we become good digital consumers? A few things we're seeing, things like websites with opening hours to reduce the kind of cloud drawdown, but then how do you balance that with a kind of global consumer base? There's things like, if you watch Netflix in standard definition versus high def, you're saving cloud emissions and so on as well. So how do we become good digital consumers in that context too? But I think more globally, and what we're seeing as kind of real priorities, there's a handful of them. So recently we released our flagship human development report, which we publish each year with a different thematic focus. This year we really identified what we're calling an uncertainty complex. In 2020 we saw the first reversals in global poverty progress for 2 decades. We're now seeing global turmoil from things like obviously climate and biodiversity crises, inequalities, technological changes and upheavals, all at unprecedented pace, unprecedented scale as well. How do we start tackling this? And we've come up with 3 I's that I think are relevant to the audience here. The first is investment. So investment in the renewable energy space, in pandemic preparedness, in tackling and mitigating natural hazards. The second is insurance, so social protection to ensure that no one is left behind or excluded. But a third one I think is particularly relevant for the people we have on the line here and listening in, is around innovation. So we need innovation in our cultures, in our economies, in our societies, and in our technologies as well. And we're all looking to you for that kind of innovation. And with some artistic license, I'll also add a 4th I into that as well, which is inspiration. With the kind of global community that Hackster and others bring together, you have real kind of unprecedented insights into the problems that we're all hearing about and trying to work to tackle. So we want to hear how you can solve them, how you look to tackle them as well. So inspire us on your journey as well, and we'd love to try and find ways to work with you all as well.
I love that. We must keep in mind today's audience. So I guess for the last few minutes that we have here, I'd love to go around to see, each of you from your own perspective and the work that you do. We talked about a little bit about how we define sustainability and how we define the term impact, how companies go green per se. And then, of the world of technologists that we have in the community that Hackster brings and promotes this idea of inspiration and innovation within this space. What advice do you have, or what resources, where do people go? I have an idea, I have a skill set, I'm ready to help, I want to make a difference. Where do they go to get that information, and where can they get started? How do they find the needs of the world where they can make an impact?
I can start if that works.
Sure.
And I'll put the resources in the chat box for all the attendees to see. But to understand where to make an impact and how bad the issue is, there's a really great resource called Project Drawdown to get connected to other entrepreneurs that want to form companies or just chat about climate. There's a couple. There's My Climate Journey, which is a good one, and then there's the New Energy Nexus. And then let's see if I can categorize these. I'll send the chat after. But and then there's if you want to already get involved with another startup that's running, and you're a developer, or maybe you've got software skills, hardware skills, maybe you're biz dev, but you want to get into the climate tech fight. There's a few resources, really great job boards. One that I really like and refer other people to, which is called climatebase.org. So there's lots of kind of small efforts that have become quite large to get all of the enthusiasm and excitement from young innovators and older innovators as well, and channel them into climate tech. And I'll put those in the chat.
Those are great. Thanks, Leo. What other resources are available?
So I guess on my side, there's 2 angles I'll mention to this. The first is just start somewhere. So if it's a local problem, a local issue, something in your community, small scale, large scale, these concepts don't matter. Just start with something. Like, it is truly a systems level effort. So just start somewhere. I think it'd be remiss as well not to mention Hackster with all this as well. What we've really learned from innovation is just share what is and isn't working. So share your successes, share your learnings. Most importantly, share your failings as well. So as a result, I think Hackster is great for that. Building a kind of community of global innovators for us is a very exciting partner to work with. But just tell us what is and isn't working, and just share your perspectives in that sense as well.
And I'm happy to jump in next. I think that people are most effective where they have the skills, but they equally have the passion. So if you think, oh, climate crisis, this is the biggest issue, I should do something to solve this, but it's not where your heart lies, you're not going to have the energy, the effort, or the time to contribute to it. So find your passion. I always think of the Japanese framework of ikigai, and where you have your skills, where you have the passion, and where that combines. But I think I would say to put aside, or at the very least, test your assumptions. So just because you think something might be the right solution doesn't necessarily mean it will be, which is exactly what Calum's described. Sharing your failures is the most important thing you can do in innovation, especially with things that need the scale and pace of change that are required for inequality and climate crisis issues. But I think something that I mentioned at the Edge Impulse Imagine conference last week, I see David Tischler on the line, is around recognizing your own sphere of influence. So whether it's personal, whether it's professional, everyone has their own unique sphere that they can influence. So like everyone else has been saying on the line, start in small, contribute where you can. These kinds of issues need everybody, every individual, every organization, every business. So find whichever bit is the most motivational and important to you and get cracking.
That's great. Yes. Joe, you were going to mention something?
Yeah, I'm a big fan too of Hackster and similar sort of competition platforms as a low barrier of entry to test out that idea, to get feedback, to see if there is some initial excitement, interest, and traction, and then see what you can do from there. And so from the Department of Energy in the US point of view, a common summary to find many of those early stage opportunities is americanmadechallenges.org. So I'll put that in the chat as well, but there's many active opportunities in many different technology spaces and ways for people to align their passion with their skill set and see if there's some interest from the community to make it more real every day that you continue to move it forward. But I agree with what everyone else is saying in that try it and see how it goes. But until you start doing it, you won't know. So just get started with something and try to grow it from there.
It's all about learning and evolving your own skill set too, right? And Thomas, I know Nordic does incredible challenges. We're doing one contest with Nordic right now with the Thingy 53. You have great developer resources available, webinars and workshops and all kinds of things people can get started with.
Yeah, that's right. So hate to make this a sales pitch, but we do have a lot of great resources just on our website, right? With how to use our development kits and devices and whatnot. We have a great forum for people to discuss problems and challenges as well. But I think most importantly to your point is that we do everywhere we can make an impact. We want to do it and we do it. And Hackster.io is one thing right now. We have this Smarter Sustainable World Challenge with the Thingy 53, like you said, where we do encourage anyone out there to Joe's point, to try, right? Try at least, try and fail. That's better than not trying at all. So we do encourage all these challenges and competitions to see if we can't just come up with the next big idea that's going to help make our planet a little bit greener.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been awesome hearing the different perspectives. If you have any other questions, those who are watching, feel free to shoot some questions over in the Discord after we end the panel here, and we'll connect with our speakers and try to get those questions answered for you. But thank you all for joining our panel this morning. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Really enjoyable. Thanks, Jessica.